Tales for Dark Nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
I thought it was strange when my new job as a live cargo handler required me to download Tor and visit a site only hosted on the dark web. I should have stopped right there, but the money tempted me too much. Their company never gave me an actual business name. They said only they were an international courier service with many local branches worldwide. The Onion address they sent me pushed a download invitation to my computer. I accepted and opened the small file that arrived a few seconds later. The Tor link doesn't work anymore, but I still have the text. I'm sharing it here so that there will be a clue if I go missing. Introduction to Animal Freight Psychology. Congratulations and welcome. As our new live cargo handler, it's important that you have a strong understanding of basic animal psychology. Identification and treatment of early neuroses in our freight helps us deliver happy and healthy products to our clients. For this reason, it's important to always keep an eye out for problems that may be developing. Through this training, we will provide fun and useful tips on how live freight is moved successfully to consumers worldwide. Study this text carefully. As a cargo handler, you are responsible for reducing disruptions and maintaining a safe environment for our workers, including you. Career tip number 1. Did you know that dogs can develop OCD-like symptoms in response to laser and light play? Although a laser pointer will be provided to exercise our feline stock, you should never use these devices to interact with canines. Nervous and unpredictable dogs sell for much less, and you may be charged for unnecessary damage to our merchandise. As a cargo handler, you will be required to ensure good health and cooperative behavior from all freight. This involves feeding, washing, and occasionally the administration of sedatives and sleep agents. You will be issued tranquilizers and further instructions on their usage at the warehouse site. Career tip number 2. Sham dust bathing is a behavior in birds that are suffering from anxiety. Avian merchandise that appears to be dust bathing without the presence of dirt or sand needs to be monitored closely. These freight items may begin to pluck their own feathers if their stress is not resolved. Likewise, horses that are observed to engage in stable vices, kicking at stable walls, lignophagia, cribbing, etc., should be logged and reported to your supervisor immediately. Our worldwide clientele demands total discretion and privacy. Under no circumstances are you permitted to discuss the details of your work with non-employees. This rule is strictly enforced, so be sure to follow it. We will not be held responsible if anything happens to you or friends and loved ones in the event a leaked trade secret is traced back to you. Career tip number 3. Large hominids, gorillas, chimpanzees, etc., are incredibly strong. In case of interaction, do not attempt to force or overpower one. Great apes sometimes interpret eye contact and bared teeth as aggressive displays, so avoid these while working inside relevant cargo sectors. Verbal hominids may try to negotiate with you, offer you money, or manipulate you emotionally. They are also capable of advanced planning and may attempt suicide if allowed to do so. Verbal hominids are our most expensive and profitable merchandise items. As a security measure, employees who fail to maintain control of hominid merchandise will be liquidated and/or added to our stock of living freight. Career tip number 4. Many new cargo handlers struggle with verbal hominid control. All lockup and restraint procedures must be followed fully. If a verbal hominid in transit attempts to engage you in conversation, do not respond. Reiterate to the product that it is no longer a person, and that cooperation will greatly increase its odds of survival during the delivery process. No on-site questions about our verbal hominids will be answered, so do not ask. As a friendly reminder, we will be sending a worker shuttle to your home address tomorrow at 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Wear comfortable closed-toed shoes and be ready with a pair of heavy working gloves. Congratulations again on your new career as a live cargo handler. Perform tasks as instructed, and you will get paid and be allowed to return home. That was everything it said. When I first downloaded the file, a blocked number called my phone until I picked it up. An automated voice warned me not to share what I downloaded with anyone. When I'd finally scrolled to the bottom and clicked Done with Training, my computer suddenly froze, then restarted without me telling it to. It's lucky I copied the text and sent it to my phone before that happened, because now my computer refuses to boot its OS. I can't get it out of the BIOS menus. Did they wipe my computer to destroy the file copy I downloaded from them? I've battled with myself about whether or not to share this information with anyone, but I've decided enough is enough. I tried the police, but they won't take it seriously because the link I was given now returns nothing. Even if they did believe me, what could they realistically do before the shuttle comes to collect me tomorrow morning? I keep thinking about the training text's final warning. So long as I do what they tell me, they claim I'll be paid and allowed to leave. Now that they know where to find me, do I really have any other option left?
One, 243 miles above Earth. Ivan Babachev sat quietly staring through the portal, his blue eyes fixed on the distant planet he called home, Earth. His communication laptop sat blinking on the small desk next to his liquid-locked drinking cup of what I imagined was his usual black tea. There was no odor to hint at this because it wasn't possible to drink from an open cup. I had learned what his favorite drink was through conversations and watching him prepare his morning provision. Ivan's gaze appeared empty from the vantage point where I sat. I sensed he held some serious thoughts within, contemplations I surmised he was wrestling with. I understood why completely. The first 6 months aboard Project Worldview, PWV, which was a collective attempt to grow relationships with countries who struggled to find common ground and had been very difficult to overcome. Floating just over 200 miles above the world that we had all grown up in still seemed an impossibility. Yet, here we were. The world had become filled with troubles of overpopulation, political differences, and destruction through pollution. It seemed by recent weather catastrophes that maybe Mother Earth was revolting against us. Our different countries' quarrels had once seemed on the verge of being overcome, were now, of late, deteriorating once more. Like a yo-yo, up and down, or a pendulum swinging back and forth, each day's social temperature was now as predictable as a young teenage girl's mood. Up here, each of the 3 different countries' representatives' moods were not so tightly wound, it seemed. Major economic problems, along with battles over oil and other limited commodities, were now pulling the main powers back apart, choosing instead to isolate themselves in attempts to self-preserve. PWV had been a last-ditch effort that had more than likely been too tall an order and much too late a start to harness the achievements and goals that were hoped for. After all, we were only the 3rd scientist/astronaut teams arrived and settled to be sent so far. The United States, Russia, and the representatives of the Middle East, 2 each, 1 man along with 1 woman from each region with room for 8 more. China was set to follow right behind the Middle East team, but then their troops began moving into Afghanistan, the oil fields once again being targeted. Now the 6 of us felt marooned from our homelands below. Efforts for either returning us or delivering new crews being sent were placed on hold. Tensions grew from the expected effects of close living quarters now as we were collectively wondering what would become of this floating shared retreat, with our counterparts disagreeing in most all ideals. In the beginning, I had wondered how I myself would react to the change in atmosphere and how all the different forms of everyday living would affect me. Lack of gravity, Restroom challenges, eating, even movement in general, was a harsh deviation from what we were used to on Earth. Throw in the mix of people from other countries that have stark differences in religion, politics, etiquette, you name it, it of course could very easily cause, well, a living hell. Let alone the different sexes housed in such tight quarters, i.e. hormones and estrogen and testosterone. Ivan and I were able to become friendly, finally. It was a forced intention on both of our parts, I'm sure, but we now spoke openly and kidded around with each other without leading to fisticuffs. Violence of any kind was not tolerated on PWV. We were basically on display for the world to see as cameras ran 24/7. We were expected to show how we could and should get along to work out these global challenges we were all faced with back on Earth. Talks convening back home had not been going well. Up here looking down on them, well, we were excelling right now. We all had been dreading China boarding the project, but we would see it through, when and if they should arrive. They were the latest aggressors with intentions being very secretive, pulling out of world peace talks and breaking bilateral agreements. Soon, the UK, North Vietnam, Korea, and Canada were scheduled to arrive on board. Now, though, everything was on hold. We hadn't even received the latest rations delivery. We weren't in any dire straits yet, but we were all beginning to ration things more carefully. I sat close enough to Ivan, I noticed the flash of worry across his face. I suspected it came from the day's communique from his superiors, the one that the flashing light gave away on his laptop. His look of seriousness displayed within his eyes sparked a worry that seemed deeper than usual. His counterpart, Elizaveta Agapov, sat behind him and to his left. Her eyes bounced between Ivan and me. My female counterpart, Lexi Towers, had intimated that Elizaveta was interested in me and had been asking questions about my state of relationship. I had laughed it off for weeks, but when we literally bumped into each other at the entrance into the personal quarters corridor, PQC, I'd realized Lexi had indeed been correct. 2. Spoken in Arabic. Tarek Badawi leaned into Fatima Farsi's ear and quietly spoke. "This place is the White Devil's nest, Fatima." He shook his head with disgust. "We should return to Amman as soon as possible, before we are drawn in too deep within the den of sin. Allah is very displeased by all of this." "Tarek, we must kill these demons and take their tongues as trophies before we return. Otherwise, would suggest our cowering defeat." "World peace? Bah!" Tarek's dark eyes reflected his disdain for being sent here in the first place. "Do we die here, or do we choose to die in our homeland? The end is on its set course as we speak." "Tarek, we cannot sit and wait for such things to happen. We were chosen for a much more important reason than to just come here and watch from above like an albatross, like the carpet viper's venom. We must also kill from the inside out." "Woman, do you truly stand here in my presence and presume to tell me what our purpose here is? You would be stoned for such arrogance if we were back home." Tarek's eyes narrowed as he lifted them upward. "Allah, one true God of all, how shall I admonish Fatima for showing such contempt and scorn towards me?" "Oh, Tarek, are you not aware of the changing world we now live in, up here in this community of sharing and love that we have entered?" Fatima guffawed. "All I would need to do is scream rape, and you would be crucified by any of the other infidels aboard, put out of the base and into space." She grinned coyly. Tarek's eyes tightened and instantly became hotter than red glowing branding irons. "You cannot live in two worlds at once, Fatima, enjoying Allah's way in one world and the devil's in the other. A woman's legs parted that distance opens her up for much deserved pain. And maybe the pain you imagine in your backward ways is actually pleasure in this new world we live in, amongst the lower creatures who live to gratify themselves with sins of carnal lust filled with sexual titillation," Fatima cackled. Your words of such heathenism are blasphemous against Allah Fatima, and he will punish you for speaking to them so easily. Erick pushed Fatima against the wall as he pushed his palm against his door entrance scanner, causing the door to slide open. We shall see how you handle a serpent of sin. The door to Tarek's personal quarters quietly slid to a close after throwing Fatima through. 3. Communication from Earth. I understand, Pavel. This is most unexpected. When will we cross into Ukraine? Yes, relations here have been adequate. How much time? Yes, I understand. We must claim final victory, Ivan. While my heart breaks for humanity, final dominion over our enemies is all we have left. This triumph of superiority has been laid upon your shoulders for our mother country. Yes, Pavel. Shall I inform Elizaveta of this vital knowledge? Can she be trusted to carry out this mission, or will her emotions rule and interfere? Elizaveta is loyal. She will fulfill the necessary steps to complete the victorious end. Ivan, they must witness the destruction of their worlds. This is directly from the mouth of President Putin. He wants the dogs to see their world devastated before they die. Elizaveta, my God, that was incredible. I held no idea that sex 200 miles above Earth could be like this. I glanced back out through the portal, seeing the blue and green orb hovering in the dark vastness. What will your comrade think of this connection we have made together? My comrade has no ties or hold over me. Besides, she's the one that told me you were interested in me. Rob smiled and then continued to grin. I'm sorry, I can't erase this smile that is plastered across my face. What does this plastered mean? I don't understand what you say. Is this good thing, this plastered? It's a wonderful thing. It means I want to do this again. If I never make it back to Earth, I'll die a satisfied astronaut who rode a rocket 245 miles into space to make love to a beautiful Russian woman. There is nothing better than sex while we travel 17,000 miles an hour hovering above where home used to be. Yes, a smile plastered across my face is a good damn thing, Elizaveta. Well, I must admit, our two worlds colliding together are explosive. Her eyes suddenly teared and her mood sank. Okay, Elizaveta, what did I just witness? I cannot say. She looked away to the portal as she nested into Rob's stomach. Ivan will be looking for me soon. You don't belong to Ivan, do you? Not in the way you are saying. Stay forever then, I said with a smile. Elizaveta tore her gaze away from the portal and turned to face me. Forever may not be as long as we think, Rob. Where did this come from? I asked. A tear squeezed from each eye and rolled into the air, hovering in between their faces. I was told to say nothing. She watched her tears as they hung weightless between them, but I don't think I can keep silent. 4. Eyes glued to the outside. Elizaveta could not keep her secret quiet from Rob. Ivan was furious with her. I trusted you, Elizaveta. You have betrayed not only me, but Mother Russia. What matter is it, Ivan? Their world is going to be destroyed. Mother Russia is soon to be no more. This is what we are to have. This world and these other 4 will survive. She refused to lower her head in shame. The President wanted us to be the final ruler. How will this be possible now? What miracle can give him all this now? The door slid open and in came Lexi and Rob. Ivan, we need to talk, Rob spoke. Yes, we do need to speak. Elizaveta glided around her colleague and approached Rob. This is almost unexpected. Ivan drew in a deep breath and held the rail as he turned to glance back out through the large portal to their world below. I was given orders, as I'm certain you now have heard. It seems it has come to the final hours. Vladimir wanted me to have you all watch the destruction and then put you down like dogs. But I now understand that Elizaveta has betrayed those wishes of our president. What good would that do for us? For you? Rob questioned. We will soon see if our countries are really so foolish with pride. The way I see it, this is a separate world divided from the one outside that portal. This world will also end without that world to supply us. Ivan's eyes sank deep into his brow. 11.5 billion souls are about to meet their annihilation, and here we are, hovering above, waiting to see it happen as if it were a theatrical release of sorts, each wondering what should happen next with us spectators who hold no control. Should I fight to be the last alive to prove my loyalty to an ex-KGB monster who is going to push the button that begins and end of the world as we know it? Ivan turned away, unconcerned if he were in danger from Rob. He stared at the colorful orb they were racing around at over 17,000 miles per hour, a complete rotation every 90 minutes. It's beautiful, isn't it? He looked back to Rob. Elizaveta pulled herself close to Rob, taking hold of his hand and squeezing it tightly. It seems we have been part of a great experiment which no one will know the results. Ivan laughed. Does the world down there even know what awaits them? He guffawed coldly. He looked into Elizaveta's eyes, then over to Lexi and back to Rob. I'm a scientist, a cosmonaut, not a murderer or a presidential puppet. There was a series of flashes that lit the inside of the space station. Ivan snapped his gaze back to the portal. Oh my God, he actually did it. Rob, Elizaveta, and Lexi quickly maneuvered to portals where they could view what was happening. A series of brilliant explosions lit the surface of the Earth from one side and then the other. The brilliant blue, white, tan, and green colors began blackening in growing circles of dark bleakness containing fiery oranges, reds, and yellows. All sounds in the room fell silent. Blinding white edges almost instantly appeared sporadically around the outer edge of the planet. The colors began to dull very quickly as the Earth's stratosphere quickly filled with tons of airborne soot. Within minutes, the earth tone colors were swallowed by black with only subdued flashes of oranges as bright yellowish whites broke through the darkness, leaving a round shadow underneath the planet as it slowly disintegrated. Their world as they once knew it was gone, almost instantly devoid of all life, and the four stood speechless. Sounds of sighs and heavy breaths filled the darkening room they four shared. The quiet swish of the door opening that was usually almost unnoticed was suddenly a sound so loud it disturbed the quiet emptiness of the room and drew their eyes to turn. It was an act of sick reassurance of what we were seeing was not just a figment of each of our imaginations. Erick and Fatima's complexions were both pale and gaunt, their yellow tannish skin appearing almost ghost-like, the white rounds of their eyes like spotlights shining into the darkened room. Erick was the first to speak out. Allah forgive us. We failed to slay the demons amongst us. Fatima maneuvered clear of Erick as if to distance herself from his erratic words. Before the door slid quietly to a close, all lights within their sight began to flicker. Each instrument light, room light, and screen blinked on and off repeatedly until blackness replaced the flashes. Total darkness swept over them both inside the main room of the lab and outside the portal. They were engulfed by a shroud of cold, stark blackness, blacker than any darkest night one had ever seen on Earth. Nary a star shined. The Earth's flashes of fire and explosions swallowed up in an instant. Cold. 5. Silence broken. Hello? A single word sliced through the chilled emptiness. Soon sounds of shivers came from different places surrounding her. Is anyone still out there? She quietly asked, hoping for a response as she attempted to get her balance and bearings. Elizaveta spoke out. Ivan, are you still with me? When there was no response, she called out again to her new lover. Rob, Are you here? Are you okay?" A frigid chill rushed through her body. It felt deep within her bones, as if she had instantly been encased in a block of ice. She tried to speak out again, but the words became shards of frozen glass in her mouth. She felt her attempt to speak now slice through her tongue, laying it wide open before it became too solid to feel. Panic instantly overtook her mind as she gasped to take air into her lungs. Her throat stung from the cold that barely entered in through her nose and mouth. She had struggled, but all her mind would allow was a feeling of internal invasion. As much as she desired to fight the overwhelming and foreign feeling, she surrendered to it completely. Cold, stillness, dark. Elizaveta's eyelids pushed against the thickness of her surroundings and closed, covering what were her brilliant blue eyes. The color Rob had told her matched the beautiful sapphire blue waters of Earth lying hundreds of miles below them. His last whisper she had heard as he lay on top of her then heated, moist body. Silence. 6. Aftershocks. Elizaveta opened her eyes to the warmth of warm skin lying beside her. Nestled tightly under a blanket, her bottom, legs, and back felt almost steamy hot. There was a faint light coming from a round opening across the darkened space where she lay. Faint sounds of relaxed breaths, escaping now, echoed behind her. Her mind suddenly painted a picture of the face of a man from possibly the Middle East. Erick? She silently questioned. She remembered a scenario of lovemaking last night, but it wasn't Erick, was it? She slowly turned, attempting to move easy enough as to not wake the person beside her. The body next to her stirred as she shifted her weight and lifted herself up slightly so she could see the face. Her head suddenly felt as if it were in a clamp being squeezed tightly. Her temples throbbed. Fatima awoke in her cabin. She felt as if she had gone on a binge last night. She closed her eyes tightly for a few seconds, hoping to will away the pain behind her forehead and temples. She also struggled to remember just what she had done to bring on such discomfort. She suddenly smiled briefly. There was a shadow of a memory that she and Erick succumbed to sexual weakness. No, she thought to herself, Erick was far too traditional in his ways. He would never have... Fatima searched her darkened room to make sure she was indeed alone. She quickly felt satisfied she was, and that she was possibly waking up from a dream. She glanced over to the digital clock screen on the communication module in the wall by the door. What? 13:30? How have I slept in so late? Why has no one awakened me? She asked herself as one leg slid off the bed and onto the floor, the other quickly following. She immediately grabbed her head and applied pressure to both temples. The ache was intense. She laid back down, her feet still touching the floor. Rob quickly noticed that if he kept his head still, the pain would subside, and he would then be able to try and piece his thoughts together. At the sign of any slight movement, his head would return to pounding, his temples feeling as if they would explode. His portal to the outside appeared differently. The lighting was off. It seemed as if the top were the bottom, and vice versa. He started to get up to investigate, but quickly fell back in excruciating pain. What the hell? He almost whispered because of the throbbing his speech caused. He closed his eyes and tried to recall his last hours before sleep. What was that humming? I don't remember ever hearing it before. He drew his little finger to his ear and plunged it inward. The sound felt as if it were internal, not external. The hum grew louder, and it drove deeper into his pounding head. Rob drew both hands to his ears to cover them, but the movements it took to do so caused too much pain in the sides of his head. He dropped both hands and sighed. His thoughts began to shift before he succumbed to the need to close his eyes and lay completely still. 7. Ivan. Ivan soaked in the black mist that surrounded his body. It warmed him and stimulated his soul. He was clueless what was happening to him, but he felt very comfortable with the outcome that seemed to be building within. It was power, and it was invigorating. It swallowed the fear and devastation he had just experienced as he watched Earth explode and melt before his eyes. The choreography of the different huge explosions scattered across the sphere were as mesmerizing to witness as watching a famous painter work the oils across a canvas. It was, however, mixed with feelings of loss as he suddenly realized his family, friends, colleagues perished before his eyes amid the fantastic colors as they had mixed before the blackness began swallowing the crumbling world below him. He was now feeding from those emotions. It broke him down, yet felt as if it were making him stronger, his hate for his enemies even more palatable. And to think I was befriending these dogs. Ivan took in a large breath of air, and as it exited, he could feel his frosty breath leave his body and then mix with the atmosphere around him. How am I alive? He asked himself internally. He had seen the blackness from the explosions work its way upward until the swirling murky haze swallowed up the station he was inside. Just after they were engulfed, the power to their home in space began to fail, shutting down computers and life support systems. We should all be dead, frozen into blocks of ice. Are the others also alive? These questions now began to penetrate his brain and take over the thoughts from those previously occupying the space. Erick. He is my only real threat, Ivan surmised. Fatima had shown signs of caving into the sexual clutches of Rob, putting her personal desires above her deity or country's desire. Lexi was no threat either, with her small stature and penchant to cave to the strength of a man. And of course, Elizaveta was a loyalist to Mother Russia as he. Only Erick was a danger, and he was indeed a threat. I must find him and end this concern of apprehension. Ivan focused his thoughts on lifting his body from his prone position, the E-Musk artificial gravity enabler still intact. The darkness he was surrounded in was disorienting, making it difficult to rise to any standing position. As his feet hit the surface below, he lifted himself upward and stood briefly before his head began to feel as if it were spinning. Ivan's arm reached outward, grabbing instinctively to hold on to anything to stabilize himself. Finding nothing within reach, his eyes rolled up behind his eyelids, and he freely fell backwards back onto the floor, missing the bed. His head made a loud thud upon contact, and blood exploded outward in a spray between his skin and suit as he lay sprawled on the floor. As the blood exploded from under Ivan's head, the darkness surrounded him and began to swirl and twist together, spinning faster and faster, encircling him. There was a barely perceptible hissing screech that began growing in volume as the tornado of twisting atmosphere became wider and stronger. The walls of Project Worldview began to shake and shrink and swell in a rhythmic pattern. It was as if there was a life form of some sort that battled to maintain its control of existence. Outside the portals of the PWV, the blackness that had risen from the destruction of Earth began swirling in radical mirrored movements. A string of satellites made their pass in between the disintegrating Project Worldview station and the previous location of the Earth. The orbit pattern, which now held nothing in its place but large chunks of debris being pulled out into the outer atmosphere. An entire galaxy was now beginning to react to the greed and destruction of human society and its gluttonous pride and ignorance. A black hole forming and sucking their world into its abyss. The life form unknowingly hidden in the depths of the Earth's interior was instantly ejected into the outer cosmos by the nuclear devastation. As the underground caverns throughout the globe exploded outwards, a small nucleus of that form was able to take refuge inside the Project Worldview station and attempted to orchestrate invading and taking refuge in its inhabitants. The 6 human occupants' bodies were frozen in a cryogenic state, each in their own personal compartment. The mist surrounded the inhabitants one by one and absorbed into their shells, taking control of their non-responsive bodies. In the next hours of occupation, the 6 astronauts' minds were absorbed and overridden, one by one, lulled into dropping their guard so they could be overtaken, succumbing to the new life form's existence within. 8. The menace from below. The alien was already somewhat acclimated to adverse temperatures, being nestled deep within the depths of Earth's interior. The planet's core temperatures had begun warming from the global destruction, the humans' propensity to aggravate its climate with pollution, overpopulation, and greed. The entity hidden below the soil and rock's crust had long begun its migration deeper and deeper into the core. Like a cockroach scampering across a hot griddle, the alien withdrew deeper and deeper to avoid a rise in its temperature. It needed the sub-freezing temperatures to survive. While humans craved and found heat a necessity, the opposite was true for the underground life which hung on to the same planet's attributes. This destruction of the Earth was in fact a timely blessing in aiding the life form to migrate into a more fitting atmosphere of living. Stark ice cold. It was quite possible it would now survive and grow instead of shrinking and/or dying. It did, however, need one thing that the human life forms had always provided: brain waves. These biological synapses and unseen triggering of electrical impulses and charges that the human brain gave off had always been the source of nourishment that kept it procreating its form of life and existence. Its black mist, making its way to the surface for short times to feed unwittingly from the lower intelligent creatures called humans. Here lies the rub. These two life forms unfortunately needed one another to survive. The humans needed the black misty creatures to keep their bodies from turning into frozen blocks of corpses on ice. The off-heating of the alien giving that form of survival improper intervals of a temporary thawing. The alien needed brainwave interaction to continue its existence. Where and how these forms of life would continue was the battle now at hand. This alien mist's priority was maintaining enough mental stimulation and temperature control to maintain the human's brainwave interactions for feeding. The dark mist continued to weave in and out between compartments, attempting to continue the 6 separate silent inhabitants' brain stimulations of thought and dreams. As it fed, it grew, becoming larger and filling the space of the station, warming its interior unintentionally. The quagmire within was a fight for survival. The survival of each form. Each mind of the astronauts continued their dreams of life. Life before the dilemma they were now in existed. Happy moments that had given each of them the will to live. Moments of lovemaking for some. Moments of killing for one's country for others. Held captive in their mental bliss, not knowing they were feeding the only thing that kept them alive. For the moment. Struggle continued. One life form felt nothing of the turmoil it was indeed enduring, while the other fed from thoughts emitting within their internal mechanism, its growth slowly choking it from its quiddity. Survival of the dark mist appeared to be short-lived, which would in turn erase humanity from the galaxy. Total extinction for all involved. The death of life, and no one or nothing to witness its exit. 9. Part of a plan or happenstance. Moving at 25 kilometers per second was an asteroid. The tracking screen reflected the image in a form of a flashing green light slowly moving across a screen. It's the size of the asteroid created to impact Earth 66.4 million years ago. The impact that wiped out most all life on Earth upon impact. Operator 1 spoke. I suppose there is a plan with this one? Asked Operator 2. Things don't just evolve happenstance, you know that, retorted Operator 1. This appears to be close to the path of the disintegrating Project Worldview, stated Operator 2. As the asteroid raced within sight of the space station, there was an explosion of light. Particles from the station expelled outward among a dark cloud of mist, appearing to collide into the reaching turbulence of the asteroid. It instantly became engulfed for a millisecond, as the blackness of the cloud was sucked into the niches and canyons of the racing chunk of what was once a living, breathing planet in another galaxy. The event happened in a flash of the world's existence. In the aftermath of the asteroid's path, 6 small frozen bodies could be seen hanging lifeless in the black void of space amongst pieces of metal and debris. They shine like tiny charms dangling from a bracelet, shimmering in the glow of the distant sun. They drew together in a flashing moment and slammed into each other in unison. An instant burst of slivers twinkled like a short-lived sparkler, dissipating quickly into the abyss of black. human life destroyed forever in a spectacular scintillation of fading light. The green dot on the screen changed into a flashing red glow for an instant before again returning to a fading green glow moving across the monitor. The image on the video monitor of PWV, or Project Worldview, replayed the segment of the explosion and then the occupants' frozen bodies being obliterated into a blip of particles as the mist-covered asteroid disappeared into the distance. Operator 1 guffawed and then spoke in an almost whimsical voice. "I guess the Creator made his choice. It never pays to disrespect a planet you were given to inhabit and take care of." He chuckled. "I guess we'll see how the next experiment sorts out." The black hole in the distance slowly pulled the debris into its path, slowly sucking, tumbling end over end as it disappeared from existence. A natural vacuum cleaner erasing any memory of mankind's existence and its failing disgrace into destruction. The pounding rhythmic drive of Queen's 80s hit echoed throughout Earth's previous home in the Creator's universe until dimming into silence. "I suppose you are correct," replied Operator 2. "Another one bites the dust."
What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish? Calvin McCready supposed the words were beautiful. He put the book down on the table. Then he picked up the hammer. The table was pushed up against the basement wall and illuminated only by an electric lamp. Pale light danced over the walls, which were gray and peeling. There was the smell of damp. There was also noise, wailing. Was it laughter or screaming? Calvin sometimes confused the two. Darkness crawled at the edge of the lamp's flickering arc. On the floor sat a porcelain doll, barely 2 feet tall, lace-dressed covering her legs. She tilted slightly to one side. Flecks of dirt dotted her white face, red lips and staring blue eyes. Her orange hair was frayed, her dress filthy. She'd been dragged through the mud. "Stop making that noise," said Calvin. The doll looked at him, and he looked at her. "If you don't stop with that racket, I'm going to thump ye." He gestured with a hammer. "You look just like Abigail, you know, with your bonny dress and ruddy hair. Churns me insides." The doll stared. Calvin lurched forward and swung the hammer hard down on the doll's right leg. There was a strangled crunch as it struck the concrete through the fabric and porcelain. The leg splintered, shards of it scattering out of the dress. Calvin grimaced. The noise worsened. There was a screaming white light behind his eyes. He clasped his ears. He took one last look at the doll. She'd fallen on her right side, painted face, staring blankly at a strange angle to the floor. She could have been scowling at him. Still gripping the hammer, Calvin staggered to the door and slammed it shut behind him. Silvery mist pressed against the window pane. Douglas Boyle watched thin fingers of condensation creep down before turning back to the man on the other side of the desk. The office was small and cluttered. Towering bookcases lined every wall and disappeared into the murky darkness of the high ceiling, out of reach of the lamplight. Boyle was a large man, shoulders bulging out at the sides of the Windsor armchair. His bowler hat was on his lap. With his red face, veiny nose, watery eyes, and bristling mustache, he had the countenance of a man who had had too long a stay. Boyle was also accustomed to the pungent reek of tobacco. The other man rumpled his nose and coughed. "So, Calvin McCready," gasped Dr. Ian Renfrew between wheezes. He was a weasel of a man with a sweating, balding head, round glasses, and a filthy medical coat. "I must say, Chief Inspector, I'm not sure there's an awful lot I can do to help ye." Boyle leaned forward and tapped his cigarette on the ashtray. He exhaled smoke, watching Renfrew's nose wrinkle. You spoke to McCready when he returned from Europe. Ah, yes. I see a lot of our boys when they return home. December's been a rather busy time. Christmas and all that. McCready served in the number 11 Commando Unit alongside Jeffrey Keyes, the man who received the Victoria Cross posthumously after Operation Flipper in 41. What can you tell me about him? I can tell ye, the confidentiality between a psychiatrist and his patient is valued most highly, Chief Inspector. Boyle reached inside his overcoat. Renfrew flinched. Boyle pulled out a piece of paper and a pair of spectacles, both folded. He opened his spectacles and pushed them up against his nose. He placed the piece of paper on the desk. It was a gray-grained photograph. At first, Renfrew thought it was a skeleton. Then he saw that it was a man. He recognized him, in fact. Calvin McCready was wearing a military uniform. His hair was as thin and wasted as his face, his sunken eyes black slits that glowered off the page. Malevolence seemed to leach from the crinkled photograph. Boyle slid it closer to Renfrew, who felt himself seized up at the sight of the wretched thing. Yesterday afternoon, this man abducted an 11-year-old girl from his school in Rutherglen. The neighbors saw them walking together and identified the man as your former patient, Calvin McCready. Now, that's truly awful, but I'm not finished. Margaret Dwyer was found in a basement in Bridgeton this morning. They say they found her from the trail of muddy school books. They made it from the poetry of T.S. Eliot to A Christmas Carol before they decided to just follow the screaming. Her right leg was broken. She'd been at her with a claw hammer. Oh, dear Lord. Boyle put his hand back inside his overcoat. I have a photograph of that, too. Renfrew squirmed and held up his hands. Enough. Let me explain. He swallowed. Chief Inspector, the extent of McCready's delusions is unlike anything I've ever seen. Frightening, even. You were aware of McCready's condition, yet ye did not notify the authorities? I had no reason to believe it would lead him to be violent. Was it the war that made him this way? Well, perhaps. I'm not suggesting that every man who goes off to fight for his country is criminally deranged. Mind is a peculiar thing. It can take on all kinds of shapes in the name of self-preservation. Everyone's haunted by ghosts, Chief Inspector, although they're not always the kind in the white sheet and cut-out eyes. Sometimes all it takes is a place, a person, a happenstance, for them to jump out of the wardrobe and shout, "Boo!" Renfrew licked his lips. You seem a little strange yourself, Chief Inspector. I imagine there's a lot of pressure on this case. Careful, Doctor, Boyle murmured. Renfrew smiled. It was an ugly smile. His teeth were yellow and crooked. His gums were like raw meat. You served in the Great War, did you not? You must have seen some terrible things. Tell me, what is it that is haunting ye? I don't want a therapy session. Then what do you want? Boyle leaned forward. I want to know what he's going to do next. Calvin's foot slammed into a puddle, shattering the perfect image of the moon that had been reflected there. There was a low mist. It slipped over the sodden cobbles and writhed into darkness. Calvin sprinted across Cathedral Square toward St. Mungo's Church, with its towering arches and twisting spires. Behind it, a spectral shape in the gloom, sat a low hill littered with gravestones. Angelic statues stood watch, their hands raised to the darkness. It was the necropolis. 50,000 people were buried there. Calvin suspected that one day soon he would be one of them. He hauled himself over a spiked iron fence and clambered up the hill, slipping and sliding in the mud. At the top, he turned. Glasgow spread out in front of him like a smoldering, glittering blanket. Stars and streetlights twinkled. Chimney stacks smoked. There was a noise. Electric torches flashed in Cathedral Square, casting long beams of dirty yellow light into the murk. Policemen. Dogs. Calvin turned and ran. Douglas Boyle looked up at Calvin's gangling silhouette on a hillock. "Run 'em down," he growled. Detective constables, Hardy and Miller, threw down their leads, and two jabbering Rottweilers tore through the gate and up the hill. Hardy and Miller sprinted after him. McCready disappeared. Boyle charged through the gate and up the hill. There was a crash and the terrible shriek of a horse. Boyle cursed as he ran. Gravestones and statues flashed past. There was a small paddock behind a church. Hardy and Miller were standing in front of a stable. The gate had been smashed inward, and the dogs were picking at pieces of wood that lay in the grass. The stable was empty. Behind it was a road lined on both sides with fences. "Damn," said Boyle. "Damn," he bellowed. He kicked one of the wooden chunks. His fist was clenched and shaking. "We're going to need a car." "I'd fancy he's taking the Edinburgh road," said Miller. "There's nothing fanciful about this," Boyle snarled. Calvin had ridden all night and most of the day. The sun was sinking lower and lower in the ashen sky, drenching the landscape in an inky blue hue. The mist was a pale smoke rolling over the hills. Naked trees leered like terrible scarecrows. The horse had long since collapsed of exhaustion, tongue lolling in the dirt. It would be another day before Calvin reached Edinburgh. One day until he reached Abigail. He wondered if she still lived on Shettleston Lane, where he had lived as a lad. It didn't matter. He would find her. In any case, she would not be living there much longer. She would be dying there instead. But first, he had to find somewhere to rest for the night. Calvin hurried through the mist, which billowed and curled on all sides. It had a foul, sulphurous smell. Shapes formed and melted away. Of all that Calvin could be certain was the few square yards of wiry grass that stretched away from him before disappearing completely. It squelched and splashed beneath his feet. Other than that, he could have been anywhere or nowhere at all. Calvin stopped running. He stood still, hands spread out as if his fingers were reaching for something solid in the void. He squeezed his eyes shut so tightly that they ached and stung with tears. Calvin! Calvin opened up his eyes. He was no longer standing in the hills halfway between Glasgow and Edinburgh. He was on the beach of Cashmel Cobb, the Dog's Nose. There was not mist that surrounded him. It was smoke. The rattle of gunfire echoed around. Bullets lashed at the ground, throwing up sand. It was happening again. Calvin watched as Lieutenant Colonel Keyes died in front of him. Blood spat out of a hole that had been punched through his chest. He died screaming a woman's name. Whispers called to him. It was as if they were breathing down his neck and yet calling from far away. "Calvin!" It was not just Geoffrey Keyes. It was the little girl as well, Margaret. Had that been her name? They're so silly. Make me laugh again. And Abigail. "Love ye, Calvin McCready?" Calvin shrieked and ran. "Calvin!" Murky blueness surrounded him. There were flickering shades of gray, shadows, silhouettes. A huge shape appeared in the distance. Calvin barreled towards it. Muddy puddles splattered. Grass tore at his legs. It was a house. It emerged from the haze like a ship from a sea storm. Chimneys crowned the roof on each side, which was tall and pointed like some dark fortress. Slates were missing. The black stone walls were overgrown with dead brown moss. Some windows were smashed, some were boarded. All of them were dark and decrepit. The front door stood at the top of 3 cracked steps hidden behind 2 columns. It was in shadow. A tree stood before the house, a gnarled black hand clawing out of the mud. Calvin stared at the house, and it stared at him. There was an evil in the way it perched on the hill, a gargantuan spider bearing down on a fly. Calvin shuddered. Calvin! Calvin made his choice. He sprinted toward the house, up the stairs, and crashed into the front door. Calvin! The whispers were getting closer. Calvin kicked the door. It shook on its hinges. He kicked it again and threw it open. There was only darkness within. He entered the house and slammed the door shut behind him. The slam boomed through the house. Calvin leaned against the door, breathing heavily, before turning, panicking, and twisting at the lock. It had broken when he had kicked it in. It was stiff and heavy. It most likely had not been touched in a long time. Years, perhaps. On either side of the door was a wooden hook. Looking around, Calvin found a plank leaning against the wall. He placed it on the hooks, barring the door. The whispers would try and get in. Calvin would be damned if he'd let him in. There was a round window next to the door, sheathed in black curtains. Calvin pressed his face against it. The oppressive fog was rattling against the glass. It seemed to be getting darker. He'd have to find light soon, otherwise he would not be able to see his own hands. Calvin turned away from the door. He was in an entrance hall. Wide open doorways led off to shadowy rooms to the left and to the right. A dilapidated oak staircase coiled up into the darkness before him. The smell reminded Calvin of the basement in Bridgeton. Damp, time-worn, abandoned. It was extremely cold. Everything was either black or close to it. The floorboards were a dark mahogany. The floral paisley wallpaper was cracked and peeling. Scratched brass frames hung at odd angles, the pictures worn and undistinguishable. Dust coated everything. Everything was still, and had been for a very long time. Yet the house seemed to fidget. The building itself seemed to breathe. Curtains rustled. The grandfather clock ticked, its beats hollow and echoing. Calvin craned his neck to look upwards. The roof was cloaked in darkness, but somewhere in the rafters a bird beat its wings. Calvin took a step forward. Creak. He looked at his foot and pressed down again on the loose floorboard. Creak. 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 Hello, he called out. The house called back to him. Hello. 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 He was alone. Calvin crept over to a gas lamp that was hanging on the wall at the foot of the staircase. The orb was cracked and opaque with grime. Cobwebs clung to it like a ghastly bunting. Calvin pulled the chain. There was no spark. He peered up at the stairs. It was too dark. He couldn't see further than the first dozen steps. It would not be a good idea to go up there. The house was old and unlit. He would likely break a leg or worse. No, Calvin would stay downstairs where it was safe. He shuffled back through the entrance hall into the room to the right of the stairs. It was a dining room. The same black curtains were draped in front of the three tall windows. Dust hung in the air, glistening in the dirty light that shone through the windows and onto the long dinner table. A brass three-pronged candlestick stood upon it. The candles were yellowed and shrunken. Melted wax that had long since cooled dribbled down them. A chest of drawers sat to the side of the table. Calvin found matches in the second drawer under a bundle of old papers. He lit one. It flared for a moment before settling into a quivering orange flame. Calvin took it to the candlestick and lit each candle in turn. The three flames bathed the room in a warm orange light, the shadows creeping away. Calvin allowed himself a long, rattling sigh. He supposed that he could pass the night in this place. It had clearly been untouched for years. He'd broken the lock, a heavy lock, that had stood guard on the house for a very long time. The house was empty. He was completely and utterly alone. Creak? Calvin froze. The noise had come from upstairs, somewhere within the dark recesses of the house. Old places were always murmuring. Pipes spluttered and the wind sighed. But what Calvin had just heard was a floorboard moaning with the same purpose and intensity as someone scratching their nails down the full length of a blackboard. Calvin stood utterly still, waiting for the noise to happen again. But it didn't. There was a seething silence, apart from the beating of the clock, which seemed to stretch out and intensify in volume like the pounding of a drum. It matched the beating of Calvin's heart. Beads of sweat were cold on his brow. He could see the last few steps of the oak staircase peering round the door from the entrance hall. It seemed to be inviting him upstairs. "Come on, Calvin. Come and have a look." Gripping the flaming candlestick in one hand, he used the other to pull the hammer from his trousers and hold it aloft. The flames swooshed through the air, causing all of the shadows to wheel on their axis like winding clocks. Calvin edged forward. The staircase crept into view from the edge of the door. 3 steps, 5 steps, 7. Slowly making his way back across the entrance hall, Calvin strained his eyes to see the top of the stairs. The candlestick threw its light into what looked like the end of the corridor. Calvin made his way up one step at a time, each one groaning under his weight. The arc of the candlelight followed him upwards, shrouding the hall once again in darkness. Calvin stood at the top of the stairs. His breath was high-pitched and rapid. He could only see so far down the corridor. A thin rug lay on the floor. Doors ran along each side, all of them closed. There was no way for Calvin to see beyond a few feet of shuddering candlelight. The corridor may have begun to twist like a skewered pig on a spit, leaving Calvin to scramble up the wall to the ceiling and round and round. It may have suddenly plummeted straight down into the fiery depths of hell. There was no way of knowing. There was just dark. "Who's there, then?" Calvin asked. His voice suddenly sounded very small and shallow. The glow of the candlestick peeled back the shadows as he advanced. There were more doors. Calvin checked each one in turn. A lavatory, a study, and a storeroom. All dark, damp, and dripping. Calvin came to a door that was unlike the others. Halfway up the blackened wood, as if written by a child, were the scrawny capitals, Thomas, in rough pencil. Calvin stared at the name for a moment. He pushed the door open with a hammer. It screeched on its hinges as it swung slowly open. It appeared to be a boy's bedroom. The orange light of the candlestick flickered over the walls, making cobwebs dance. There was a wooden rocking horse sitting in the corner. It had clearly once been painted white, but had long since withered and grayed. Its wide eyes stared, its mane hung in tatters. Shitty sticks were propped up against the wall. Red, torn leather balls lay dotted around the floor. The 4-poster bed stood in the middle of the room, drapes hanging from it in rags. A chest of drawers was pushed against the wall next to the door. Everything was adorned in a gray sheen of dust. It was very cold. There was a cracked casement window on the opposite side of the room from the drawers. It was open. The chill of the air numbed Calvin's skin. He padded across the room, carefully placed a candlestick on the windowsill, and watched his own white reflection heave the window closed. There was a click as the lock fastened. Calvin breathed out heavily, watching it leave his mouth. He picked up the candlestick and walked over to the drawers. Placing it on top, he pulled open the first one. There were more papers. Letters, newspapers, school reports. Calvin thrust his hand in and was surprised that they did not crumble in his hands. Time had stiffened them. They were crunches, as if he were digging through a pile of frosted leaves. Calvin stopped. He touched something cold and hard. He swallowed and withdrew his hand slowly. He was holding a tin soldier, wearing a blue uniform and carrying a tiny rifle. Calvin looked at the dabs of red and blue paint that were his rosy cheeks and smiling eyes. He threw the horrid thing aside. The toy clattered into the corner of the room. Calvin had relaxed slightly. There was no one on the upper floor, and certainly no whispers of any kind. How could there be? There was no way for anyone to enter without him seeing them, and he was hardly going to say, "Hello, why don't you come in?" Calvin placed the hammer on the top of the drawers next to the candlestick and wiped the sweat from his brow. He could feel the frenzied scherzo of his heartbeat slowing from allegretto to andante. But he still had his back to the window. There was a packet sitting on top of the drawer that looked newer than the rest. Calvin picked it up and, using his stained fingers, slipped it open. The contents were emptied into the drawer. Enlistment papers. Calvin picked up the first. It was addressed to Master Thomas MacDonald, born in 1925. He had enlisted in the 51st Highland Division. Calvin threw the paper aside. It swooped across the floor. The second was for Master James MacDonald, born in 1919, also enlisted in the 51st Highland Division. That was thrown over Calvin's shoulder. The third was for Mistress Jeanette MacDonald, born in 1881 and enlisted in the Women's Royal Naval Service. They had all enlisted in 1941, the same year as Calvin. The papers fluttered to the floor. He picked up the hammer again. He was hunched over the drawer, his breathing haggard and heavy. That was why the house was empty. The little boy had grown up in the room, but he had long since marched to the war, burning fields of blood, bullets, and sharpened metal. The house, too, had been left to rot. He was sure the house had been beautiful once. It had taken the war to show its true face. Despite everything, Calvin smiled. Everything made sense. Then a cold breath of air touched the back of his neck. Calvin whipped around, taking the hammer and raising it above his head, ready to swing, but there was nothing to swing at. The window was wide open. The black curtains were fluttering in the icy breeze. Silvery moonlit fog gyrated outside. Calvin stood there, heaving, hard hammering against his ribcage. His terrified gaze drifted slowly downward. It was as if he did not dare, could not dare, to even look. But there they were. Muddy footprints, black in the moonlight, crept over the windowsill, down the wall, and across the floor toward the door. Whoever had left them must have walked right past him. While one side of the trail was small and clearly defined, the other was a smudged line, as if whoever had left them had been limping, as if they had a broken leg. "Calvin!" Calvin screamed. The sound was naked and shrill. It pierced the frozen air and threw itself around the room, along the corridor, down the stairs, and into all of the dark corners of the house. The voice had come from downstairs. It was also one that Calvin recognized. It was a voice that had sown its seed in his head the first time he heard it. Its foul roots had clung there ever since. Abigail. The sound of her lit a flame of something deep within him. Calvin remembered the act he had bestowed upon himself. With one hand, he wrenched the blazing candlestick from the drawers. With the other, he gripped the hammer. Calvin marched out of the room. Those strange, lopsided footprints continued into the corridor. They dragged themselves along the rug and out of reach of the candlestick's trembling glow. As Calvin prowled forward, he expected at any moment for them to come to an end and for their crooked author to be revealed. But they didn't. Calvin came to the stairs. He looked over the banister and down into the entrance hall. It was a lot darker. Calvin could no longer see the front door. It was simply black, broken only by the orange pool on the mahogany floor that spilled down the stairs from the candlestick. The footprints began to descend the staircase. It Calvin's gaze had been drawn from them quite suddenly. He was looking at the thin shadow of the woman that was cast on the candlelit floor. Calvin placed one foot on the staircase. Creak! The shadow disappeared, flitting out of sight. It was the titter of childish laughter. Calvin took the stairs slowly, one by one. Creak! 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 He followed the footprints. Calvin imagined whoever left them taking each step in turn and waiting for their lame leg to drag down with a thud after them. Creak, thud. Creak, thud. Creak, thud. It almost came as a surprise when he reached the bottom. Calvin felt the energy that pulsed through the veins and arteries of the house. It was alive in the same way a jungle was alive. Shadows flickered in the candlelight like branches. Leaves quivered in the wind. Something was about to pounce. The candlestick blew itself out of its own accord. The flames were extinguished as if some invisible person had snuffed them out to be replaced by 3 smoking wicks. Calvin felt a winter chill rush through him. Blood turned to ice in his veins. Calvin could see nothing, not the hands that were clutching his useless weapons, not the end of his nose. Everything was black. He staggered away from the stairs. There was nothing. There was just the black. Something was close to him, though. He could feel it. All of his insides were screaming it. Then there came the voice. It was a sweet voice, smiling and yet brimming with venom. It was Abigail's voice, and it seemed to come from all around. "Do you think I'm beautiful?" asked Abigail. Calvin whipped round and round. He swung with the hammer. It made a whistle as it sliced through the air. "I ain't afraid of you," he shouted. "You sound like her, but I know you're not. I'm going to find her, and when I do, I'm going to crack her skull on the paving stones." It was hideous laughter. "Do you think I'm beautiful?" Abigail repeated. "There ain't no beauty," stammered Calvin. He gestured with a hammer he could not see. "This is all there is. Blood and iron, nothing more." "But you do think I'm beautiful," said Abigail. "You think I'm the most beautiful thing you've ever seen. That's why you want to smash that hammer into my head, so my brains run out my nostrils." Calvin's eyes were beginning to become accustomed to the new darkness. He focused his gaze on what he believed to be the foot of the staircase. There was nothing there. What was frightening was the fact that something had been there a moment ago. There were other voices, too, Calvin moaned. He recognized them immediately. "You left me in the dark," giggled Margaret Dwyer. "How do you like it?" Calvin could hear the shuffle of a broken leg. Thud, thud, thud. Tell her for me, please." Jeffrey Keyes breathed his last all over again. "All she has to do, if she wants to see me again, is close her eyes." They were getting closer, circling him as beasts would circle their prey. Calvin could almost see Abigail's face, gray ribbons of flesh dropping from her skull, smiling teeth through tattered lips and black eyes glinting. "You'll kill me, and then what?" Abigail jeered. "The whispers will stop? The world will make sense in your silly little head?" The last of Calvin's courage slipped from him. The hammer and smoking candlestick fell noisily from his hands. He cowered to the floor. "I beg ye," Calvin cried. "I beg ye, mercy, mercy, mercy!" Laughed Abigail. "What place is there for mercy in a world of blood and iron? Mercy is the beauty of the soul. What place is there for that?" Calvin shrunk into himself, pulling his knees up to his shaking chest and clawing at his hair. Tears squirted down his cheeks. "I don't know what to do," he screamed. Calvin couldn't see Abigail, but somehow he knew she was smiling. No, it was worse than a smile. She was grinning like a wolf. "Don't fret, my love. We'll show ye." "Out of the way, ye damn fool!" Boyle pushed Hardy aside and kicked the door. It threw open, one of the hooks, holding in place, retching from the wall. There was a noise like thunder. Dust scattered to the floor. Sunlight streamed into the house. Boyle towered in the doorway. "Mother of God," he breathed. McCready was sitting cross-legged in the middle of the mahogany floor. A bloody hammer was laid down in front of him. He raised his hand. Boyle could not tell whether it was a greeting or he was shielding himself from the blinding glare of the sun. "I've been waiting on you," he smiled, blinking dumbly in the harsh light. Douglas Boyle and Calvin McGreedy stared at each other. There was something in his eyes, Boyle thought, something different. Boyle did not trust it, but then Boyle didn't trust many things. Was old-fashioned blind luck one of them? It had been a long, arduous night of scouring the moors with torches and dogs. Boyle had seen the old house sitting on its hill from across the valley. Here was McCready. He might as well have put the shackles on himself. Boyle sniffed. "Take him away," he said finally. Hardy and Miller pulled McCready roughly off the floor and let him out of the house. He didn't struggle. Boyle followed them out the door. The house was on a hill overlooking a shadowed dale. The sun was rising over the valley, tingling the last of the morning mist with a yellow, pale light. The sky was a pallid blue. The police car had driven up to the house, leaving muddy tracks in the lush grass. McCready stood in the doorway for a moment at the top of the steps, Hardy and Miller firmly gripping the sides. He looked at the hills in the distance. "You know," he said, "this place is beautiful." Boyle watched as McCready was led down the hill and hauled into the back of the car. The door slammed shut behind him. Hardy and Miller strode up toward Boyle, who was still standing on the steps. His gaze was fixed on the police car as if he could see McCready sitting, hunched over inside. "Congratulations, sir," said Hardy. Boyle grunted. He took one last look at the house. Dull light winked off the grimy glass of an upper window, as if it knew something he didn't. Then he strode heavily down the steps and onto the grass, his overcoat flapping in the breeze. "Miserable bastard," said Miller, watching Boyle climb in front of the door. The door shut with a bang. Boyle watched frost spread slowly across the windowpane, as blood would a white tablecloth. The view of Glasgow evening was obscured by an icy veneer. The first snow was starting to fall outside. There were 2 armchairs in Boyle's living room. He sat in one. His overcoat lay across the other. The fireplace rustled between them, throwing orange light onto the crinkled white walls and stacked bookcases. A patterned rug lay on the floor. Within arm's reach of Boyle's chair sat a gramophone on a low coffee table. The flame's distorted reflection shimmered on the curved surface of the horn, making the scratches flicker across the brass. A log in the fireplace snapped. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked and talked. It was the warm smell of beef stewing in the kitchen. Boyle leaned across to the gramophone and pulled down the stylus. It settled into the waxen grooves of the record disc. Boyle did not need to check the disc. It started its unsteady spin on the needle. Tchaikovsky's Sixth Symphony crackled away quietly. He leaned back in his chair. The music was quite beautiful. Douglas Boyle smiled and closed his eyes.
This is a dream. The room swirled misshapen around me. The vague contour of belongings I knew to be mine, my bed and dresser, the clothes piled in the hamper alongside them, all sat in a foreign arrangement, askew and twisted against walls seated in wrong directions. Everything was silent, dark, like the night itself had stopped to hold its breath. This isn't my room. I inhaled. Paper crunched beneath my ear. It came back to me. Scattered on the desk beneath my head was supposed to be my midterm. Just like this was supposed to be my room. My new one. Like the end of a drawn-out sigh, the night breezed back to life. The quiet whir of electronics wound quickly in the background, filling the vacuum with their gentle cicada hum. The flash of my clock slithered between the glass bottles that shared the desk with me. The aftermath of my getting through the first months of college. My room. A place in a city I didn't know. Surrounded by people I didn't know. Even the roommates I'd never had the courage to truly speak with, just left as strangers who lived on the other side of my door. It was a place I'd wake up sometimes still and realize after a moment I wasn't home. I left my head down, letting it swim as the light flashed in and out. Midnight, it told me. 12 in big green numbers. The room would appear in the brief moments of lucidity, distorted through the bottles, then blink out. Rhythmic, rising and falling. Awake, not awake. Real, not real. Maybe I actually was dreaming. Until the hiss of static flooded from my television, churned by a light that drowned out the dark. Uneven, flickering like 1,000 struggling candles. I pulled my head from the desk, half flailing to protect my eyes. I fumbled around, searching for the remote as the gray haze blared from the glass. Thick noise poured like gravel through the speakers. I felt the small rectangle underhand, quickly pointing it at the screen. Nothing happened. I clicked it again and again. Tossing the useless thing aside, I scooted up close, groping at the side of the box. Snow and thunder filled my senses, the rush of light turning sickeningly in my sleep-deprived and beer-sloshed brain. I felt the power button depress under my finger, cutting the signal out. Everything plunged into darkness, except the screen. It didn't quite die, just clicked with electricity under the gray surface. Lines of flickering static crept slowly in as the blurred outline of an image appeared in the glass. Cutting through, fading into a sickly green, until it drenched the room. Lingering white cuts hissed as the image slowly pieced its way together, stuttering like a tattered VHS, forming into the outline of a room at night with dark, vague shapes of furniture, with a television set against the wall, flickering erratically between dead channels. My eyes slowly grew accustomed to the brightness, the room emerging further into solidity through a haze of scan lines. Grain crackled. I licked my tongue against my dry lips. I studied it. Everything. The pile of clothes, the posters on the wall, the desk with stacks of bottles arranged in an unruly mass. Felt familiar. A chill crept through me as I looked at the desk. The bottles, the TV, everything placed on the screen just as they were next to me. Everything the same, down to the dark mass that slumped in the very chair I sat in. The silhouette of a man slunk low, his head turned toward the television, motionless and obscured by the screen that burst and crackled with light. I turned instinctively in my chair, half expectant to find someone standing on the other side of my room. Only my bed and the wall stared back, as empty as they had always been. I turned back to the man on the screen, his features hidden in a drape of shadow. I thought he might be dead the way he sat, near catatonic, and with his head fixated on the screen, sitting and staring. Only the gentle rise and fall of his shoulders betrayed a sign of life. What the hell was this? Hidden camera flashed across my mind. I'd read about that on a forum. Stories about two-way mirrors in sleazy hotels and pervy landlords with holes drilled in bathroom walls, recording illicit videos used for blackmail or sold on the internet. The idea of a camera placed in my room before I moved in had crossed my mind, along with 1,000 other horrible scenarios. I found the place in an online ad. Roommate wanted, cheap, college adjacent. I couldn't afford student housing, so cheap was good. And unfortunately, cheap can also mean sketchy. But this was it. My big, brave first steps into the real world. First time on my own in a new city. All my worrying about secret cameras, of kidnapping and serial killers, it was just paranoia, I'd convinced myself. I was quickly having second thoughts. That wasn't all that was twisted into a pit in my stomach. It lingered in the room like an unseen presence, that I was watching all of this unfold in front of me as it was happening, that this was real. There was a man there, in my room, sitting in the very chair I felt against my back, like I could reach through the screen and touch him. I flipped the VHS deck open on the bottom of the TV. Empty. I could scratch recording off the list. Movement on the screen caught my attention. Not from the man, but the door. It crept open at some point just behind him. There was no sound, only the hum of my television. The door opened wide into a pitched murkiness that I knew to be the hall. There in the dark, something stirred. The indistinct outline of shoulders and a torso, given away only when the TV would flash just bright enough to land over them. Someone waited, faceless in the heavy grain, a slight sway to their figure, standing like a drunk. The man at the desk moved for the first time, a twitch, then settled deeper into the chair, unaware of the observer in the hall. They seemed to sense that and stepped into the room. The light cut jagged shadows over his features. I jumped in my chair, standing up to look back at the door in my actual room, only feet behind me. Still closed. Of course it was. A shiver tickled through my spine as I gazed over it a long moment. Like I couldn't trust leaving it alone. As if I could feel someone just on the other side, waiting in the darkness. I pushed that feeling down and left the door, back to the screen. I recognized him, my roommate, standing in the shadows of my room. Ed and Sam, the strangers I lived with. I didn't even know their full names. I'd met Ed first, spoken to him on the phone before I'd made the agreement. He was at least my age and went to the college too. We're a bit of a party house, he said. Good, I thought. Burst my way out of the bubble, I told myself. Not sit in my room while they blasted music all night, yelled drunkenly and fucked the place up, littered the house with detritus, old food and bodily fluids. Then there was Sam. He lived on the couch for all I knew, a burnout with a hairline thinning into an unkempt scraggle and a sparse goatee. A man who stood well over a foot taller than me. I don't think I'd even seen him sober, not that I'd ever really spent time with him. Just a passing what's up in the hallway on a good day. Said he went to the college too, although I'd never seen him there. The first week told us a lot. That we weren't friends. That we simply existed in the same building out of convenience, because it was the only place any of us could afford. that I'd made a huge mistake. How much can you really get to know a stranger in a few months? What they're capable of? Now Sam stood in the grainy video, in my room, unmoving the entire time I'd watched, just swaying with that drunken stagger, until his head lifted, came up to stare, blank and expressionless. The round dark circles over his eyes watched forward through the distortion of degraded tape, looking right at the screen. Unease probed along my skin as I watched him back, like he was standing right in front of me. He smiled, a grin all too wide, toothy and pointed, stretched like rigor mortis on a cadaver. He turned, stopping as his eyes came to rest on the man at the desk. With a glance back, as if to make sure I was watching, he took a step, coming to stand within arm's reach. The man didn't stir. It took a second for it to come into focus. Something dangled from his hand, a long strap with a metallic glint at the end. The glimmer came into view as he raised it. A belt. I knew it instantly. Sam's pride and joy. A gaudy, oversized buckle emblazoned with a steer skull. What the hell was he doing? I leaned close to the TV, half standing in my chair as Sam lifted the belt, holding it taut between his hands. My pulse climbed into my throat as the man twitched in his seat. He wasn't going to. The man shifted, just a small twitch. "Wake up, damn it," I thought at him. "Wake up." A shake of his head. He was coming to, agonizingly slow. Sam hovered the belt just behind him. I was almost out of my seat, leaned so close to the TV static crackled against my nose. "Get up, for fuck's sake, get up!" I wanted to yell at him, or slap the screen till he heard. "Get up, goddammit, get up! Turn around! Behind you! Look behind you! Look at it!" Like a starter pistol, the thought had turned into words, slipping out in a half-scream, half-groan at the set. "Look at him!" Nothing as gentle as a stir this time. The man jolted his head straight up, swiveling, turning the wrong direction, toward me, away from the belt that just as quickly cinched over his throat, wrenching him back. A shudder coursed through his body, arms jerking out in surprise, pulling at the sudden garrote. Sam held the thrashing man tight, noose securely locked, pinning him against the back of his chair. There was nothing on Sam's face, no look of struggle, no sign of the exertion clearly visible in the knot and muscle in his arms, nor the belt wrapped so tight over his hand they turned red. He held the man there, legs kicking, thrashing against the desk, sending the television set onto the ground where it spilled out a distorting light over the two figures. The man writhed, the desperate struggle in his limbs slowing as lethargy crept in. The belt dug deep against the soft tissue. He was dying. Dying. I couldn't watch. I jumped from my chair, sending it to the ground as I mashed at the power button. It wouldn't turn off, even as I jammed my finger against it, the black circle digging against my skin. It wouldn't turn off. I should have turned away then. That's all I had to do. Just move my head. Just close my eyes. Just don't look. But I didn't. A deep, morbid pull glued my eyes to the screen, forced me to watch. As the man's body twitched, the last of his life silently choking out in front of me. Bottles spilled from the desk, rolling and crashing into each other, up until the body slumped over. Sam held the belt until the form stopped twitching. He let the body fall against the desk in a heap, where the dead man's face finally came into view. That wrench in my gut tightened, the one I'd had since first seeing the screen, roiling in my stomach, working its way into my chest, like I was going to throw up. Glassy eyes stared out from a face already bloated. A dark bruise straddled his neck, up to the edge of his jawline that sat off kilter, pressed at an angle away from the face that revealed the broken structure beneath. He stared lifelessly toward me, the TV on the ground gracious enough to keep the entire thing lit, to show its details with a sick clarity, to show that it was me. What I'd felt since the video first started. The shape of his head and shoulders, the way he held them, how he'd slumped in that very chair, the one now at my feet. I'd watched myself die right on the screen in front of me, killed by him. Sam knew it too, the way he turned back sedately, belt hanging loosely on his hand, the mechanical drag in his body took to move, and the rictus grin plastered over his face. Something unnerving lived behind it, a distance in his expression, like the plastic smile of a doll, set beneath eyes that knew nothing of what he was doing. An expression that didn't belong to a human being. He watched me back with it. Something like a shiver pulsed through him, given to quick, jutting convulsions of his chest, rapid and shallow, a mirthless, almost painful movement. It took me a moment in the silence to realize what it was. He was laughing. Everything cut to static. White noise choked out of the set in a rasping wheeze. I only stood blankly watching the flickering black and white specks, still seeing the outline of that last image burned into the glass. I rubbed my eyes like it could possibly wipe that picture away. I reached over and turned the TV off. It was a dream. I sat in the lamp's glow, contemplating, wishing my door had a lock. Adrenaline still lingered in my chest, a tangled mass snarled over my lungs. Just breathing felt labored, short. I was still drunk, maybe, or my drink had been spiked. I looked over at the cluster of bottles, not really believing the words in my head. It had to be a dream. The TV sat silent, its screen empty. It couldn't be real, none of it. The whole scene had the tinge of imagination. I could almost believe it had been a dream, despite the taste of iron on my tongue and the throbbing in my head. I looked at the door. A dream. Everything was fine. I listened to the night outside my window, full of crickets and traffic in the city, as it always was. I wish that damn door would lock. My clock flashed 12. Anxiety crawled over me each time the damn thing blinked. The air was always stagnant in that room, hot and suffocating. Even with the window open, not even a breeze dared cross inside. I wasn't going to fall back asleep anytime soon, and I sure as hell wasn't about to see if there was anything on TV. I should just unplug the damn thing, I thought. Throw it away tomorrow. This place. Those two words rolled in my head, caught in my teeth as I chewed them over. Blink, blink, blink went the clock. Nothing. That's what was tying me there, to that apartment. The musty, dank, cramped hole I'd walled myself into. Nothing at all. Other than money, the constant mental drain of school, all the useless shit that I bought just to feel better, that I kept in that miserable little room that I didn't even like. I slammed my fist on the desk, scattering the papers onto the ground. I wasn't even on the lease. I could just walk out that door, never come back. There was nothing stopping me. Just walk out and forget about everything. Walk until I'd found myself somewhere new. Then what? Curl up and die, probably. But I'd be free of this place. I looked down at my hand, clenched into a fist on the desk. It was shaken, coaxed on by something that lived deeper than the anger boiling through my veins. Fear. As hard as it was to admit even to myself, I was scared. Too much of a coward to stand up for myself, to look Sam in the eye, to just get up and go. Out of the nest, and truly, deeply afraid for the first time. Ever since I'd stepped into that apartment. That first week, after finding out what kind of house this was, I bought it. Slept with it leaning against the bedpost by my head. A baseball bat. 3 feet of dense maple formed into a crude club. I'd felt so stupid even buying it. In what idiotic fantasy did I see myself springing out of bed and wielding it against some intruder? The truth was, I'd never even swung the damn thing. The reality of barreling this thing into another human being hung too heavy at the far end. The idea always seemed easier when you see it in movies and books. But there was a realness to feeling it, holding it out from my arms. It felt heavy in my hands even then. I knew I'd never have the guts to use it. The bat soon found its way underneath the bed, to be forgotten, out of sight, out of mind, buried alongside the embarrassment that filled me every time I'd see it. Looking over my shoulder, I could almost see the handle peeking out. I waited there, playing with my thoughts for an indeterminate series of moments, fretting, swaying in my seat, thinking, half standing, worrying, sitting back down, until there was no choice left. I finally forced myself to do it. I got up, as quietly as I could, and walked to the door. Cracked it open just enough to peek out, to ease my mind. I looked down the hallway toward the trickle of light coming from the living room. With small, measured steps, I entered the vacuous dark of the hallway, my hand lingering on the safety of the door handle and the lit room at my back. I had to force myself to let it go and walk out. Sporadic, flashing bursts of light drifted from around the corner, splashing color against the wall, like a TV set flickering through a series of channels. The edge of the living room began to peek into focus. The exaggerated shadows of empty pizza boxes, beer cans, and a bong flickered and danced over the carpet. The table came into view, along with the back of the couch. Already the musty smell of body odor and weed swirled in the air, mixing with the stench of puke coming from the bathroom. Home sweet home. Over the scene, the television flipped through a rapid series of disjointed images, marred with the pulse of static lines. Scanning through the channels, the signal choked in and out as it came through. I shielded my eyes to see the back of the couch against the light of the TV. A foot slumped over the end. I leaned forward, the floor groaning beneath my weight. My heart skidded in my chest, and for a split second, I regretted not bringing the bat with. The foot didn't move, not even a twitch. Careful of where I placed my foot, I leaned further until Sam came into view, sleeping. Ed slept just on the other side, crumpled on the sofa chair. I almost snorted with relief, the sound coming out louder than I anticipated. Sam's eyes fluttered for a second, slowly coming to, open to look at me, a glassy look of confusion in them. We shared a look. He dropped his head back onto the couch, letting his eyes close again. Idiot! I let my breath out, realizing only then I'd been holding it. I could almost laugh. You stupid idiot. Half directed at him, half directed at me. Of course he was sleeping. Of course these two were harmless. They'd blasted themselves into such a stupor they couldn't even stand if they wanted. My palm stung. I looked down, forcing my hands to unclench. 4 little crescents were pushed deep into the skin. I let out another sigh, the feeling of relief fleeting. My chest had loosened a bit, but something still clung over it. I found myself staring at the front door, just on the other side of the couch. The only door out of this apartment, unless I wanted to risk 3 stories from the balcony. A deep longing welled in me. Home. I wanted nothing more than to just run, get the hell out of this tiny apartment and away from these strangers. Sam wasn't a bad guy, I told myself, looking down at his sleeping form. Probably has his own demons. Ed, too. I never really thought they would actually. I didn't know for sure, but the thought of it didn't feel real then, looking at him. That was something you'd only ever hear about, read in the paper. It wasn't something that actually happened in your life. I was homesick. It had been there from the moment I'd moved in. The cutting, intuitive wrongness that dwelled inside, waiting like an impending freakout that threatened to push its way through the skin. I didn't want to be here. I hadn't ever wanted to. Instead of taking that step toward the door, I pushed the discomfort down, forcing myself to think about other things, like the drink I desperately needed. I wandered my way into the kitchen, more a narrow hallway stuffed with cramped cabinets, a stove, a sink, and just barely enough room for a fridge. Then there was me, in the middle of it all. The clock on the stove greeted me, blinking as well. The whole apartment must have lost power. It couldn't have been for long. The beer I grabbed was cold. All I had to do was find a bottle opener. I fumbled around the cluttered silverware drawer, tossing over loose forks and spoons, digging for it. I stopped. It wasn't there. The large, heavy-bladed knife that sat on the left side of the drawer. I looked over to the sink, brimming with the pile of dishes. It could be there, somewhere at the bottom. It could be somewhere else. My stomach was sinking, a slow but precipitous drop. I found the bottle opener and popped the cap, attempting to talk myself down. Foam spilled from the top and over my fingers. Half-heartedly, I held it over the sink. Combating the tightening in my chest, I leaned over to the window, sliding it open. A rush of cool air washed over me. I let it envelop me, closing my eyes, just feeling the sense of fresh air in my lungs. The night hung impenetrable outside. A tenebrous, smothering curtain wrapped over our apartment. I normally found the comfort in feeling it next to me. Not that the view was ever anything to write home about. It opened out toward the apartment jammed in next to us. Only a wall and a neighbor's window. Somewhere around the bend, the light of a lone street lamp attested to the rest of the world's existence. That night, a different sense overwhelmed me, looking out. Like what I was seeing wasn't actually there, wasn't a tangible part of reality. I was a distant spectator in a different world. Lethargy clung to the air, flooded my lungs. Like there wasn't enough in the room. Like the apartment had grown smaller. the window drawn further from my reach. I stepped back, sinking. The walls around, the too-tight kitchen, the cabinets and stove and fridge, the too small ceiling, all spun, pulled the floor out underfoot. I tried to breathe, but my throat was closing, lungs struggling to hold on to any air. Choking. The thought slipped through. A groan drifted from the living room. Fuck, fuck, fuck. Sam, not fucking now. I grabbed the counter, holding myself up, spinning, lolling from side to side. I was going to pass out. Midnight blinked from the darkness. 12 a.m. 12 o'clock. Static rushed in from the living room, creeping over the kitchen floor with a pulse of nauseating light. The click of a glass followed it, knocked off the table, followed by a slurred attempt at a sentence cutting its way through sleep. I could hear him shifting on the couch. I heard him stop. What the His words fell back into the unintelligible groan. A shifting tone slid into his voice just before it dropped out. Something I had never heard before. I held on to the counter, legs turned into thin sticks that wobbled and bent beneath my weight. Fear. That's what it was. Fear in his voice. It sank deep into my spine. I pulled myself through the galley, trying to find purchase beneath my feet, enough to throw myself down the hall and into my room. Run, idiot, run! I only stared at the wall ahead of me, and Sam's shadow, standing, stretching to its full distorted height along it. I tried to say something, to yell, to force any words out, to plead with him. Tell him he's not that kind of person. You couldn't actually kill another human. All the air I had left in my chest, my swollen tongue sat like leather in my throat. Right? This was stupid. This wasn't real. None of it. It was a dream I had had earlier. Sam was a lot of things, but not a killer. Neither of them were. I found my legs, my backbone. I kept my head down and walked to my room. More of a skitter, past the flash of the television and the figure standing before it. Through the scream that filled my head as I refused to look up, to the tickle that chased at the back of my neck with each step, anticipation of the sudden jarring blow from behind that cracked my skull, break the bone into the soft flesh of my brain. But how much can you really get to know a stranger in a few short months? I turned the doorknob, slipping into the safety of the room that was not mine. I stood for a long moment, leaned against the door, until my left hand grew numb. I looked at the beer still clenched in my grip, beads of dew dripping from its surface and running over my fingers. A vision of the man standing in the hall, sluggishly lumbering through the dark, flashed as I closed my eyes. I lifted the beer to my parched mouth, wincing at its bitterness. I paced, drank, paced more, pulled the empty bottle to my lips, all while it sat there, observed me, the reflection of my room, my figure in it, pacing to and fro, only stopping occasionally to stare into its depths. Only the high-pitched hum of its capacitors responded. Just a collection of plastic, glass, and circuits, I told myself. That's all. The clock blinked. Midnight. Like only a second had passed. Everything I'd seen would sear against the TV surface, clinging like static. The man slumped against the desk, vacant eyes and that smile over a bloated purple face. I wandered to my window, looking outside at the night, the parking lot below, The road behind it. Not a soul was out. The steady roar of the highway. Dead quiet. Like the world had disappeared. That goddamn TV. I'd given up on pretending. I turned toward it, scanning over every inch of the black mirror, expectancy bubbling under my skin, like there was something on the other side of it. That it was giddy to flick back on and show me more. My arm twitched with the thought of smashing the bottle right through the screen. This was far past homesickness. I had to get the hell out, to prove the world was still out there, that there was something beyond those walls. This fucking apartment. I gave in, slid up to the TV, crawled along the side again, pressed the button. It was a dream. I was going to turn it on, prove that to myself. Then I was going to walk out of that building. I was going home. The button depressed, clicking as a whine squealed through the circuits, brightening the screen as it came to life. A rush of air pumped through me. A brief flicker sparked, punctuated by the rapid sweep of channels. One by one, it scanned through the numbers, each as empty as the last. My nerves grew more and more fraught, stretched with each staccato jump, like they were going to snap. I couldn't do it. I couldn't let myself look anymore. I didn't want to see what it decided to show me. It stopped, settled on an image, deep green and still. I only saw it for a second, just a flash of a few frames before I dropped the bottle, threw myself away from it. Crawling to the ground, I slid my arm under the bed, dug through the mess, until I felt wood grain against my fingers. Lifting it, I brought the end through the air, feeling its weight where I held it perched over the TV. I refused to look at the screen, the movement on it. Just put the bat through it. End it. My forearms tensed, violence pulsing through them, rooted into my legs. A force pulled at the bat to swing, beckoned it to smash everything. I could feel my hands tightening, gripping the handle, opening and closing, rhythmically. The bat shook in my grip. It was so heavy. I let it feebly slide down to my side, the flush of self-pity and shame a cocktail in my chest. Something did snap then, resolute and solidified in the core of my being. I left the image, playing whatever the hell it was going to play, and slid into the hall. No matter what happened, I was going to walk through that front door. I slowed, only a step into the hallway. That image, the brief second I had just seen on the TV, was playing out in front of me. This moment, this very scene mirrored on the television just seconds before. The hallway, the glow, uneven and nauseating, trickling in from the living room, flickering like tongues of flame before falling back into darkness, all with the familiarity of a recurring dream. I held the bat low but firm, already feeling blisters along my palms. Whatever it had to show me, I didn't care. I forced another step, the faint crackle of static growing louder, mixed with the hammering of my heart in my ears. I strained my eyes, pushing forward. Shadows danced across the static, like the movement of a body at the end of the hallway, perched in ambush right around the corner. The television grew brighter, blinding, watching. Sweat trickled over my brow, chest thudded as the static grew stronger, louder, pulsed in time with my breathing. The bat lifted those last few feet mechanically, the faint shuffle of footsteps. The door was right there, right around the corner. All I had to do was take the turn. A few more steps. Run. Adrenaline rushed through my legs, pushed from behind. Home. That feeling again as it came into view. Like I wasn't there. Turning the corner, my entire being pulled forward, sprinting. Right into the figure that stood in front of me. His full frame twisted at me, ripped away from the screen. A scream contorting across his face, a glint in his hand. I was a distant spectator in another world. The wood cracked with a sickening thump, a low, dull thud, like a melon smashed against concrete. It's not real. Concussion reverberated through my forearms, stinging the adrenaline-soaked fiber. A splattering of crimson slicked along the wood and across the wall as he crumpled from the impact. A dream. Silence followed. A great hush settled over the very air, perfectly still and preserved. Cold. My arms burnt, flecked with warm blood. Sam twitched in a broken mass at my feet. Red leaked from his mouth and ears, fell from his head, collected in a pool next to the remote, still in his hand, glinting in the television's light. In the distance, someone screamed, high-pitched and wailing, grief-filled. I looked over at Ed, curled in a hysterical ball, rocking, letting out that awful cry. He was making that sound looking at me, pulling away like a frightened animal, a rabbit shrieking in the jaws of a coyote. It faded as I looked to the screen, still playing. The last thing Sam had seen. On repeat, cutting back, looping a moment in the hazy light. The hallway, the light, the figure that stands at the end before stepping into our living room. Coming to a stop over the man sleeping on the couch, the bats held by their side, before they lift it, then bring it down over and over until it's stained and dripping. That's when they turn, to look at me, to laugh. My own face, standing over the butchered form of Sam. That smile on my lips. The bat slid from my fingers, clattering against the floor. I left it there. The body. The television, gleefully replaying the scene over and over. I left everything sitting as it was and stepped to the door. Unlocked it and walked outside. The warmth of blood and sweat fresh against my numbing body. My breath caught in the chill night air. Slipped away in small clouds of steam that disappeared into the empty sky. And I left the dream behind that closed door.
My brother was hanged on a Monday, and 2 days later I followed him. When the trapdoor opened for the short drop, the sharp stop never came. Instead, my soul slithered loose from my body, and I fell into darkness, landing with a crash atop a mountain of junk. Odd battered shoes, gimmicked dice, prosthetic noses, the cheats' cast-offs, the swindler's knickknacks. It all reeked of piss. I pulled the sackcloth off my head. A square moon in a black sky shed some light, but not much. It were actually the light from the trapdoor, a whole world away. I'd have seen the two black soles of my feet dangling there if I'd had the wits to look. "Hello!" came a muffled cry from behind me. I tried to stand, but the junk pile shifted under my weight. A set of cupping balls went skittering down the slope. I settled for rolling onto my belly and stared dumbly at the figure making their wobbly way towards me. They wore grayish prison clothes too, though theirs were slashed and daubed with handprints in white and red. They'd cut eye holes into their sackcloth and stitched a smirk into the stiff weave. They raised an arm in greeting. "We saw you fall." Where am I?" "Crook's Landing," they beamed. I could hear the smile in their voice, gesturing at the view from the mountaintop. "You're dead." I followed their hand. A city grew out from the base of the mountain, buildings dipping and then rising again in the middle distance, their shingle roofs overlapping like scales in the dim light. A stiff breeze dragged the stench of the canal behind it, bringing sluggish brown water to mind. And, if I squinted hard, I could make out the millions of scurrying bodies in the streets and back alleys, like a plague of ants. So, this was Crook's Landing. Journey's end for the street grifter, the slick confidence man, and everyone in between. I'd heard about it all my life. How could I not? Growing up above the corner pub. When my brother and I stood at our dad's graveside, his mates clapped our shoulders with tattooed, signet-ringed hands and said, "I'll be in Crook's Landing now, lads." It was an afterlife, a prize, a club. But it weren't real. No more real than heaven. I turned back to the figure on the mountaintop. They'd pulled off their sackcloth masks to give me a chipper wink. Underneath was a boy, hardly older than my brother, who probably got caught up in his local pickpocketing racket. I'd seen kids like him before. He pulled me unsteadily to my feet. "That's a bit of a shock, right?" "Bit of a shock to be in the afterlife I always took for bunk, and I threw a right fit over it. I can tell you, I thought the moment before death must have sent me around the twist. But it's much easier to say I simply nodded, shook his hand, and said, "Yep." "I'm Nosy," he said. "I'm with the Breakneck boys, I am. Saw you fall, we did. Just thought we'd come over and say hello. Better than letting them thrashers get you first. You do look like a breakneck, I reckon." By then, the rest of the gang that called themselves the Breakneck Boys had joined us on the mountaintop. They wore prison clothes too, slashed like nosies, and had decorated their sackcloth masks with sneers and smiles. This mountain was their patch, they told me, and they saw all the newcomers by Scaffold fall out of the sky. They made it their mission to welcome them, recruit them if possible, and at all costs keep them out of the reach of their rival gang, the Thrashers, who lived on the next mountain over. Did you see someone fall 2 days ago?" I asked. The question came so easy, I didn't stop to wonder that I could remember to ask it. My little brother, Charlie. Oh, he'll be scared shitless by all this. Nosy scratched his head in amazement. "The days up there don't mean much to us down here. I hadn't had a new boy in a while anyways. Can't speak for that lot over there, though." By that lot, he meant the Thrashers. Their mountain was smaller, darker, really more of a dune. The gang members gathered along its spine like crows watching us. They'd all seen me fall too. Perhaps they'd seen Charlie. I told Nosy and the boys that I had to ask them, and Nosy agreed to show me the way. "Will you join the Breaknecks when you get back?" said one of the boys, and I had to shake my head. If Charlie hadn't joined the Thrashers, then he must have gone down into the city, and as the older brother, I'd always sworn to look out for him. "Oh," said the boy, crestfallen. Then they perked up. "Can we have your togs? Some of us needs new ones. Got a bit carried away, we did." So, with me dressed in whatever scraps I could get from the mountaintops, we headed over to the Thrashers, skidding down the junk slopes and slashing our forearms on the edges of game card decks. "You must really love your little brother," Nosy said, pinching together the bloodless but no less gruesomely parted flesh near his elbow. "Yeah," I said, winded, as we climbed the next peak. "I really do." and I grasped then for a memory of him, something to make Nosy laugh, and found it was hard, like sinking my hands into tar. A month after my dad had died, I couldn't remember the sound of his voice or the color of his eyes, and I reckon it must work the same way when you're the one who's dead too. Already I couldn't even remember my mom, and her face had been the last thing I'd seen before they put the sackcloth over my head. I clapped my hands around my skull like I was trying to stop it breaking apart. Nosy flinched. "Oh, sorry. It's just, you must really love him, because most people clean forget as soon as they come here. You all right?" Layer by layer, by texture, by smell, by sound, I dredged up an image of Charlie, a boy of 13 with a buzz cut, hard eyes, and a loud mouth, dirty fingernails, surprisingly delicate tendons at the nape of his neck, the soft hollow between them. I hadn't seen him hanged, didn't like to picture the rope chafing him there, where the toughness fell away, and he looked like a little bird. It'd been me who talked him into working that last scam, and all the others before it. Mom lost the pub when Dad died. She'd lost one home, and we were going to lose another. She didn't tell me as much, but I'd seen it in the single slice of bread and jam she gave Charlie for supper, while we went without. Dad's mates were still hanging around, and I was a tough kid who looked older than I was. Didn't take much to fall in with them, work some short cons. Mom didn't like me doing it, but pretty soon she relied on that money, relied on my building it back up from scratch, rent day after rent day. Charlie started skipping school to help me out, because it was just like Dad always said, real work, not passing some poncy exam, was what put food on the table. So, it was my fault Charlie'd been with me when our sting stung the wrong mark at the poker pits. It was my fault they prosecuted us, the only sons of the late, great Mackenzie Foster, with the full force of the law. It was my fault they slipped a noose around his bird-like neck, and it was my fault that Mom was alone. The Thrashers said the same as the Breakneck Boys. That is, time passed differently in Crook's Landing, and 2 days was impossible to peg. But they grudgingly brought their newest recruit forward for inspection. I don't know what I feared more, not finding him, or finding a boy who wouldn't remember me. But none of them were Charlie. So I shook the gang leader's hand and turned cityward. Nosy spat at their feet and hurried after me. Where would he have gone? I asked him as we drew closer to the murky lights. The mountainslide slowly turned to scree. I don't know, he said. Newcomers just slip in where there's space. They might have ended up in the fighting rinks, I suppose. At the startled look on my face, he added, Not to fight, I mean. That's where all the big business happens. Oh, Kenzie Foster holds court there. I bet he does, I said grimly. My old man had come to Crook's Landing and set himself up with a racket then, eh? Old habits, I guess. I didn't like the idea of meeting him again, but it was the most likely place to find Charlie. The dolt idolized our dad, almost as much as he did me. Where are these rinks? Well, you want to head towards the spire there? The one with the crow? No, not the one scaring the man. Blimey, oh! That's an unlucky place to fall. And keep down mountains at 5 o'clock. You'll find it. You can't miss it. Right. Thanks. Nosy nodded and towed the scree like he had something else to say. But when I asked if he wanted to come along, he said, Nah, got to pick my patch, you know. I'll see you around, I guess. As I crossed the bridge that spanned the canal, I glanced back at him. Dwarfed by the mountain of junk, he looked tiny and lost, like a boat snipped loose of its moorings. He probably never missed his memories, never spared a thought for them or the aimlessness of life in Crook's Landing, until I came along. Even on that bridge, con men went through the motions of find the lady, beckoning me to come and place your bets, while over the railing beggars feigned twisted limbs for coppers, just as they must have done when they were alive. With most of their minds scored away, it was all they knew to do. But there weren't no gullies to perform for down here. There was only the rest of us, and we knew all the tricks. Nosy jammed his sackcloth over his head and went back to his boys. I pressed on towards the spire, cradling my memory of Charlie close, like a cut purse cradles his loot. It was the only thing keeping me, well, keeping me. The streets clogged up closer I got to the fighting rinks. Nosy was right to say you couldn't miss 'em. I was carried along like blood in a vein as the citizens of Crook's Landing surged towards the city's heart to do business, pay levies to my old man probably, or settle rows, and be pumped back out again afterwards, refreshed and ready for trouble. The alleys and side doors around our pub had worked the same way, pinned between a one-eyed hag and a tall, dark-skinned hawker. I had no chance of finding Charlie in the crowd, but Hawker soon noticed my restlessness and stood on tiptoe to scan for my brother's buzz cut. I described for her the twin tendons of his neck, like a swallow's tail. "I can't see 'em. Sorry." She shrugged, and then she said enviously, "Oh, you must be fresh to remember something like that. I don't remember nothing. This old lady could be my gran for all I know." The one-eyed hag huffed and turned her face away. "I just came from the... I realized I didn't know what to call the mountain of junk looming over the city, but she caught on to my vague gesture. "By Scaffold, eh?" She lowered her voice. "How comes you ain't got your tugs?" The breakneck boys took 'em. The hawker nodded. "Well, that's just as well if you're going to the rinks. Kenzie Foster and his lot don't like what come by Scaffold. They says a good crook don't get caught." She offered me a slim hand to shake, though by now we were crushed so close that the formality made us laugh. "I'm Jack," she said. I went to say my name, but nothing came out. I just gripped her hand tighter. "Ah, so you don't remember everything." Jag elbowed me the way I often elbowed Charlie. "Well, that makes me feel better." While I tried not to panic about forgetting my name and the tiny part of myself that goes with it, was I Bill? Barry? We turned with the crowd into the gawping entryway of what looked like an old meat market. The roof was made of ironwork that would have let in a fresh breeze and some pigeons if Crook's Landing had any, and stalls had been squeezed in along the walls, upper walkways, and across the floor, peddling... What? What do you peddle to people who don't eat or sleep or remember anything except how to wring money out of an unsuspecting mark? Some stalls sold clothes or wigs. Others upcycled the kind of junk I'd crash-landed on. Others ran transparent scams like games at a fair, or hawked dodgy ointments for things like baldness or athlete's foot. They weren't fooling anyone, especially Jag. I felt again the same hollowness I'd felt on the bridge, that we'd all come to Crook's Landing to blindly chase our own tails forever. This petty street stuff was below my dad anyway, so I sliced my way shoulder first through the throng of anonymous bodies toward the center where the noise was loudest. Jag followed me, muttering something about collecting a debt, but I reckon she simply didn't have anywhere else to go. Nosy said Charlie probably hadn't come to the rinks to fight. Most people didn't, but a fight was happening regardless. I could hear the meaty thunk of fist meeting face, or feet squelching in a slurry of ancient shit. A rowdy audience penned the fighters in a circle, shoving them together when they broke apart. Hands were everywhere, waving coins and betting slips like little flags for the bookies to snatch up. I avoided an elbow to the face and climbed up the side of someone's stall, ignoring the sounds of protest from inside. From the striped canopy, I had a better view. The fighters were still fresh, though one had a swollen eye, and the other a limp I guessed must be fake. I watched the men trade blows despite myself, even whooped when my guess proved right, and the limping man shifted his weight to kick the other man in the balls. But the swollen-eyed man just laughed it off and pulled a leather guard out of his trousers. It was a game of trickery. A straight fight hardly passed for entertainment between crooks with nothing better to do. Me and Charlie weren't idle long enough to watch the boxing down in the warehouse district. I promised him I'd sneak us in one day when Dad weren't looking. I never did. He would have loved this. More spectators watched from the walkways above. The mood was quieter up there, like they had bigger fish to fry. I recognized my dad in the middle, but he didn't match the image I had for him in my head. He was smaller in person, slimmer. Death had made him a giant to me. His long brown hair was all plaits and wooden beads, and his 2 gold front teeth gleamed, just the same way they gleamed in the dark of our room when he came to kiss us goodnight. His breath had smelt of copper, of blood, of palms and dirty coins. Jag followed my gaze with a frown, then shot me a warning look as I hopped to the next stall and the spiral staircase nearby. 2 lackeys blocked the way up, but I knew them. "I need to see my dad," I said over the roar of the crowd. "Who?" they snorted when I told them. "Old Kenzie ain't got no brats. Now clear off!" My chest was tight. "But he does! Charlie and me. He died when we were just kids, and you," I pointed to the one on the left, "you died in the shootout with him, right? Your name was... Your name..." But it wouldn't come. Their expressions turned odd. I looked at the right-hand one, who flinched. You used to collect rents from my dad and drink pints of bitter in the pub afterwards. You used to peel all the designs off the back of our coasters, and my mom went mad because we got them printed specially. Charlie liked picking the scabs off of your knuckles to see if you'd react. Oh, come on! There was no dawning recognition, no smile of acknowledgement. But it was like I'd smacked them with words, because they let me through in a daze and took me to my dad. And he brushed me off too, until I told him about Charlie's thin flannel pajamas patterned with ducks, the silver studs he'd bought me when I turned 11 that stained my lobes green, and how the pub carpet always got gummed up with spilled beer and fag ash. I knew then that Charlie couldn't come to him, or he'd remember all this already. Wouldn't he? I trailed off. My dad was still looking at me like a stranger, but he gripped my shoulder and took me with him when he and his racket finally left the rinks. He'd made the harbor his stomping ground, on the far side of Crook's Landing. The journey there felt as long as the walk from our flat to the square where I'd been hanged, and Mom had moved as far away from that life as she could afford. Distance made the mountain of junk look half its height, but space worked strangely here. If I stood on the jetty out to sea, the farthest I could go from the mountain without wetting my heels, and squinted really hard, the miles would fold in on themselves, and suddenly, Nosy and the boys would be right there, waving to me. My square moon, my entry point, still hung in the sky above them. Time hurt my head too, because how can you mark time when the light never changes? When there's no tide, no ticking clocks, no pulse. I explained to Dad that Charlie arrived 2 days before me, but the longer I spent here, the more I understood his confusion. Never mind Charlie. How long had I been here? A month? A moment? Crook's Landing, for all it seemed real, could be a dream, playing out in my head in the seconds it was taking my neck to break. "How's your mum?" my dad asked vaguely while eyeing a fake diamond. I don't think he remembered her really. He was just asking because he supposed, as his son, that I must have one, and he should ask. It's not like he remembered her when she was alive, neither. He'd valued his name more. "She's fine," I said. She'd lost her sons and her main source of income within a week, and before that, she'd been left a penniless widow. But yeah, sure, fine. He grunted. "You both followed in my footsteps, then." Yeah, he hadn't left us much choice. Charlie's smart, though. Should have stayed in school, might even have won a scholarship. He and his cronies got a laugh out of that. You can't be too smart, neither of you. It's nothing, you're so young. What happened? Jag had warned me about my dad's dislike of newcomers by Scaffold. I sketched out that final sting in the poker pits for him, the one that got us caught. The look on the guy's face when he realized we duped him. The look on Charlie's face when we realized we had the wrong man. The back doors of the poker pits that opened inexplicably onto kitchens or cold, dry rooms full of hanging pig carcasses. We got lost. We had to fight a few bouncers off. I think Charlie hit one round the head with the chair. Then I made up some stuff about being tackled just as we got clear of the pits and getting shot later at a sleazy clubhouse, and sat quietly while my dad listed everything we'd done wrong. We'd aimed too fucking high, he said. He flung the fake diamond across the room in disgust, hitting a lackey in the face. His temper hadn't changed then. I used to cover Charlie's ears at night when he really got going, when Charlie grew old enough to be scared. I was scared too, but unlike now, I had a little brother to distract me. You're shot though, eh? He cooled and leaned back to look out the window overlooking the harbor. Same moon as me, then? Same what? Same moon, you idiot! He jabbed a finger towards the sky. A bullet hole. Yeah, the moon's the way you come in, right? But he was a shade of a man he'd been, for all his raging. Pity replaced fear pretty quick once I'd hung around long enough to see him go dead-eyed like the rest of Crook's Landing. He only looked lively when someone said his name, but in a way like he didn't quite know why. I lingered on the edge of the world in case Charlie turned up, killing time by watching the dark boats pass by far out to sea, but he didn't. And the longer I waited, the longer this place worked on me, the less I cared. I still remember the details, the duck pajamas, the bread and jam, but they were becoming as random and disconnected from me as the bits of shell and seaweed scattered across the shore. Jag drifted into the harbor eventually. You didn't tell me Kenzie Foster's your dad. She sat with me at the end of the jetty. You ain't looking so fresh now. Did you not find him? Who? Her mouth thinned. Your brother Charlie. Got a neck like a swallow's tail. When I looked blank, she walloped me. Don't you be going feather-brained on me now, kid. I've been going round asking after him and all. Don't tell me I've been wasting me time. Charlie. Charlie. Charlie, yes! How could I have forgotten? Had he fallen in with some scruffy kids by the canal? Got picked up by a slumlord with wandering hands. Wherever he was dead at 13. I was right. He should have stayed in school. My fault. I liked it. Us foster boys working together. Handing our combined spoils to Mom at the close of each con felt like giving Dad the finger. What if Charlie had stayed in school? He'd be alive. Educated. He'd put a hold down a proper job. He'd have kept our Mom much better than I ever did. Some brother I was. Some son. My square moon still hung over the mountain, with my limp feet dangling halfway between that world and this one. I told Jag how they'd hanged him. They might have shared a noose. Jag listened, watching our own private sky. You know, asking about Charlie's giving me noggin a good prod or something. I remember someone tapping rocks to me ankles and tipping me in the river. I sank, and I sank, and I never hit bottom. Just fell out here. And she didn't sound sad, but happy. Happy to remember something about herself. She sniffed wetly. Water slapped the stilts on the jetty. The harbor had always been silent. I leaned over and watched the water bob and curl against the wood where before it had been all as still as glass. What's that? Jag said, pointing out to sea. A boat was sliding towards us. One of the dark ones, from out where the water met sky. Its passenger was cowled, and something in my gut told me this weren't no human soul, but a native creature of Crook's Landing. The prow bumped against the jetty, and the creature turned to face us. Its gaze was cold.
"We've all heard you calling for your brother, we did,"
it said, tapping its chest.
"We are touched by your bond."
I was still on my hands and knees. I gripped the end of the jetty. Silk stung my palms. Do you know where he is? Is he all right?
Charlie Foster fell for. Landed himself in Cutthroat Cove.
I glanced up at Jag. She gulped. Cutthroat Cove is to murderers what Crook's Landing is to us. You ain't told me he killed no one. I scrambled up, fists clenched. He hasn't! The creature lifted a finger.
He took a man's life before the end of his own. He's already told us how he struck them down. They died shortly after.
The frantic escape from the poker pits. The bouncers. I heard again the dull crack of the chair hitting the guy's head. A sound I'd taken for breaking wood. I'd actually been bone. I raked my nails down my face. But listen, he don't deserve to be lumped in with murderers. It was an accident. He's just a kid. Mom had let me feel her belly the first time he kicked. He was strong. With him, it wouldn't be just me and Mom against my dad anymore. I was only 4, but I swore to look out for him, didn't I? Since then, I'd done anything but. So I thumped my chest. I'm responsible for that man's life. I'm the reason Charlie was there. I'm the one who should have known better. You have to let me take his place. You can't, Jack cried.
We accept.
Seriously? The creature inclined its head.
Charlie Foster's young. Cutthroat Cove does not suit him. Yet, a life has been taken, and his place must be filled. Come with us now, so that he can be restored to the living world.
Living world? I frowned. How is that possible? He was hanged 2 days before I was. He died.
Oh, did you hear the bones of his neck snap? The creature asked. Did you watch him cut his body down?
I had to admit I hadn't. We'd been kept apart in prison and my cell had no windows. The sight and sound would have driven me mad otherwise. Small mercies.
All times existed once in death,
it said.
And Charlie Foster's neck did not break. His breath has been stopped by a moment. Although that moment has been enough. We'll arrange for a last-minute reprieve on accounts of his age. He will be cut down, and he will soon forget us.
You can do that? The creature nodded.
How's else you think peoples would know to take the name of this place back with him?
As I tried to breathe. Well, I don't need to breathe. That's just a habit, I'm dead. Jag gripped my arm. I started remembering myself, and it's you what done that. I don't want to forget again. None of us do. I held her hand. Over on the mountain, the thought of Charlie was spreading through Nosy and his boys like wildfire. In the darkest corner of the fighting rinks, my dad's cronies muttered about a boy who picked at the scabs on their knuckles. In his workshop, Mackenzie Foster recalled the day he hammered a nail through his oldest son's lobes to pierce them. On the bridge spanning the canal, a one-eyed hag whispered about a swallowtail neck. She would soon peer up at the sky, her head tilted to favor one side, and think. Swallows. Birds. Remember those? Crook's Landing. was waking up. I don't think you'll have to worry about that ever again, I told Jag firmly, and something about my tone told her it was okay to let me go. I climbed into the boat. As we slid away from the shore, sinking deeper into death, I turned to the creature. How do I know you'll keep your word?
Think about the last thing you saw.
The last thing I saw. I'm standing on the scaffold, looking down at my bare feet and the huge iron hinges of the trapdoor, trying not to be sick. My toenail was broken. The hangman moves behind me and my head jerks up. Is it happening? I'm not ready. I'll never be ready. The square's packed. There's my dad's mates, the ones who are keeping quiet right now so they don't hang too. There's my teacher, the man who bought the pub after we left, and the baker's wife who slips Mom an extra loaf every once in a while. Before the too large sackcloth goes over my head, I see Mom herself, and I hold her gaze until she starts to cry. She bows her head and kisses the crown of a buzz-cut boy. Her arms cross his chest, pulling him close. His neck is raw, same as his smile.
Chilling tales for dark nights.